Carbs, 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 carbs. Carbohydrates are probably one of the most controversial topic in the field of nutrition, especially when it comes to fat loss. And in this video, I'm going to share some tips and how I manage carbohydrates for my athletes when they come and see me for improved body composition. Hi, my name is Nick Hedayatpour, also known as a strength artist. Welcome back to my YouTube channel, and in this video we're going to talk about carbohydrates. I'm going to give you some tips on how I manage carbs when it comes to body composition. Unlike proteins and fats, carbohydrates are actually
non-essential.
What?
Meaning that you can perfectly survive without carbohydrates. But just because they're non-essential doesn't mean that they're useless, and in fact it could be the difference between achieving a great body composition or athletic performance, or taking a consolation prize, or telling yourself, okay, fuck it, I can't stick to this diet anymore. So just because they're non-essential doesn't make them useless, and in this video I'm going to give you some tips on how to use them. When it comes to carbohydrates, I have 3 rules only. Rule number 1: genetics. Some people seem to be able to metabolize carbs better than some other people, and this has to do with an enzyme which is called amylase. Amylase is an enzyme that's produced in your mouth, and the more of this enzyme you can produce, the better and faster you can break down carbohydrates, which means that you can metabolize them more efficiently. There was a study, I think in 2007, and came out, and they looked at what is the gene copy and the numbers of those gene copies that help to produce amylase, and that gene copy is called AMY1. Let's just call it ME1. So it seems that the more AMY1 copies you have, the more amylase you can produce, therefore you can metabolize carbohydrates better. For example, in the study it was found that Japanese people have more copies. If I'm not mistaken, it was 7 or 8 copies on average for Japanese people. So they seem to have more copies of AMY1, which suggests why they can metabolize carbohydrates better. But if you look at, for example, like Inuit people in northern part of Canada, they have as much as 70% of the diet made up of fat and the rest protein, and practically no carbohydrate. So there seems to be a strong correlation between genetics and carbohydrates. Now, if you've done genetic testing with a reputable company, you might have seen this in your chart. So AMY1 is the gene copy and amylase is the enzyme you want to watch out for. Of course, you don't have to do a genetic testing just to find out whether you're tolerant to carbohydrates or not. And I'm going to show you a simple test that you can do. Here is how to do the test. Next time you're going to have breakfast, I want you to make it a very carbohydrate dominant breakfast. So for example, you can have pancakes and some ice cream and some maple syrup. So you make it very carbohydrate dominant. So you have that, and then after 1 or 2 hours, you want to pay attention to how you feel. If you feel fine and you don't suddenly have an urge in energy followed by a crash, and you seem to be a stable person and your energy level seems to be constant, nothing too crazy, that might be a sign that you're actually carbohydrate tolerant. But I have to warn you, this test will work better if you're a leaner individual, because it's been shown that if you're carrying excess body fat, your blood sugar as well as your insulin level probably is not going to be in its optimal health. So the results of that test might be a little bit skewed. So if you're a leaner individual, this is something that you can try. But if you've done genetic testing with a reputable company, then that's something that you can also keep in mind. So genetically, if you can tolerate carbohydrates better, then the chances are that you should definitely have carbohydrates even if you're trying to lose fat, and I will talk about the how and why and how much later on in this video. Rule number 2: if you're carrying excess body fat, the chances of your insulin and blood sugar health being optimal is actually pretty low. Doesn't mean that it's going to happen to every single person on this planet, but it's been shown that the more body fat you carry, your insulin health as well as your blood sugar health are just not very in optimal ranges. So even if you have the genetics to be able to tolerate carbohydrates well, but you're carrying excess body fat, what I would recommend is that at the beginning, so it could be anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 weeks, it really depends on many factors, it's best to approach your fat loss training and nutrition with a low carb eating plan. Okay, and this is to make sure that you're resynthesizing and bringing your insulin and blood sugar back to where it's supposed to be. Of course, there's many factors involved in that, not just when it comes to carbohydrates, but this would be a good place to start. So the leaner you are, even if you're trying to lose fat, the more carbohydrates you can have. But if you're carrying too much body fat, I would recommend you guys to have a low carb approach, at least initially, and as you get leaner, you can reintroduce more carbohydrates back into your eating plan. This is also because that insulin is actually a very anabolic hormone. Anabolic meaning it promotes protein synthesis, therefore it will build lean tissue and muscle mass. But it's very important to understand that insulin is anabolic to both muscle tissue and fat tissue. So depending on how lean you are and how much of a training volume you have, it can favor one another. If you're overindulging in food and you're having too much food, and it would put you in a calorie surplus and you're not a very active person, well, guess what? Your insulin is going to be biased towards fat tissue. But if you're leaner and you're training at least 4 days a week, then it is more biased when it comes to muscle tissue. So it's a very anabolic hormone, but depending on the overall environment, it could be either in favor of fat or muscle tissue. So of course, when it comes to fat loss, you want it to be in favor of muscle tissue. Rule number 3, training volume. In a fat loss training cycle, generally you're going to be working with higher training volume and total amount of work. You're not going to be able to maximize your fat loss with heavy sets of singles and doubles and triples. Typically, you're going to be doing higher repetition. Doesn't mean that you should not do heavy lifting. In fact, you should. And perhaps I'm going to make a video series when it comes to fat loss training. But for now, remember that you do have some heavy portion, but pretty much most of the work you're going to be doing is going to be a higher volume type of training. So the more volume you have, the more energy you're going to be mobilizing, because your cortisol, which is cortisol and adrenaline, which are your stress responses, are going to be mobilizing energy to provide for the amount of work that you're imposing on your body. So if you're going to be doing a higher training volume, well, guess what? You're going to be needing more energy, and it has to come from somewhere. So of course, you don't want it to come from muscle. You don't want the body to break down its muscle tissues to provide energy for the amount of work you're going to do. You want it to come from food. So in this case, carbohydrates could be very helpful. So the more training volume you're going to have, the more carbohydrates you can take advantage of, because they are your body's preferred way of using energy, because it's very simple for your body to use carbohydrates as opposed to fats or protein to break them down to use for energy. So carbohydrates can be very helpful if your training volume is higher. In my previous video, I talked about protein being the number one priority in macronutrients for many reasons, especially when it comes to preserving muscle mass, which should be your goal in a fat loss training cycle. Now, once you've taken care of protein, now it's the time for carbs. Carbohydrates are also a great macronutrient to preserve muscle mass as much as possible. Of course, you want to make sure that your protein is in adequate level. Only then you should think about carbohydrates. Now, let's talk about why they are important when it comes to preserving muscle mass in a caloric deficit. So of course, since you're going to be in a negative energy balance, which, remember, it's the one thing that you need to take care of. It's step one. Anything outside of that doesn't matter if you're not in a negative energy balance. So once you put yourself in a negative energy balance, your body is out of homeostasis, that equilibrium, that balance. So it's always trying to find a way to bring you back to that homeostasis, meaning that your body is going to be responding to that stress. So since you're going to be stressed, your body needs to get that energy to deal with stress from somewhere. And on top of that, remember, you're going to be weight training 4 days a week, which is also added stress to your body. So you want to make sure that you provide an environment for your body not to break down muscle tissue. That's the worst thing that you could do when it comes to fat loss. So you want to preserve as much muscle mass as possible. Once protein is taken care of, then it's time for carbohydrates. Like I mentioned earlier, carbohydrates are easier to break down as opposed to proteins and fats, so they make an excellent choice when it comes to an immediate fuel to use to deal with the stress, especially when it comes to training. If you drop carbohydrates too low in an attempt to lose fat fast, a bunch of negative things might happen to you. Number one, muscle glycogen depletion. Remember that the goal of a fat loss cycle is to preserve as much muscle mass as possible. So once you've taken care of your protein intake and you're well hydrated, you want to make sure that your muscle glycogen is also intact. Let's say you've had a couple of days of low carb, you start looking a little bit flat. It's something that people talk about in the bodybuilding or physique community as well. When you go low carb, your muscles are not going to have that full look, and the reason for that is because your muscle glycogen is actually depleted. So once you start to fill up your body with carbohydrates, you're replenishing your muscle glycogen, you will see that your body starts to fill up, you look fuller, and that's what they're referring to. So you want to make sure that you're doing whatever you can through water, protein, as well as your carbohydrate intake to ensure you're preserving as much muscle mass as possible. Number two, when you drop carbohydrates too low, and of course too low could be different for different people, what ends up happening is that your blood sugar is going to be low. When your blood sugar is low, there are two hormones that come into play, glucagon and cortisol, which allow you to bring your body back to that homeostasis, to bring your blood sugar level up. So when cortisol goes up, once again, it's in stress response. So you're stressing your body, and since you're already going to be in a caloric deficit or negative energy balance, and on top of that, you have stress from your finances, your work, your training volume. So it's not a good thing to keep adding stress. So you want to make sure that you have sufficient levels of carbs to ensure a steady the level of blood sugar, so that your cortisol and glucagon do not have to go into overdrive. And the third point is that if you drop carbohydrates too low, your performance in the gym, especially when you do higher volume of work, is going to be affected. So of course you don't want something like that to happen, because that's actually something that can preserve muscle mass and also put you in a negative energy balance by all that work that you do in the gym. You do not want to go to the gym, and just because you've gone on a super low carb diet, your energy in the gym is going to be very low. You're going to have a crappy workout. That's just not a good feeling to have. So you want to make sure that your performance is not going to be affected, at least dramatically, by decreasing your carbohydrate intake too low. I still hear it to this day. Carbs make you fat. Bull fucking shit. Two things: bullshit and horse shit. It's not true. It's a bullshit and a horse shit claim. No macronutrient has the power to magically make you gain fat unless the combination of those macronutrients are putting you in a caloric surplus and you're an inactive person, so you're not utilizing that energy to increase muscle mass. So if that's the case, yes, the combination of those, once they put you in a caloric surplus, they can make you fat. But carbs by themselves cannot, physiologically, it's just not possible. They cannot make you fat. So get that out of your head. This is Momo. Momo had a slice of cake last week entirely by herself, and she doesn't feel bad about it. She doesn't come to me and cry, I'm gonna gain fat. No, because she understands that a macronutrient cannot magically make you fat. It's just not gonna happen if you're in a negative energy balance. So don't worry about it. Be like Momo. Right, Momo? She approves. What determines whether you're going to lose fat, maintain weight, or gain weight is going to be energy balance. Go back to my first video. I explained that in details. So that's the one that's going to dictate the outcome of fat loss, nothing else. But when it comes to macronutrients, they can determine how you feel. Some people, like I mentioned earlier, are going to respond better to a high carb diet, some of them low carb, some of them medium. So everyone is going to be different, and there's factors involved, which I explained earlier. So if you go on a low carb diet in an attempt to lose fat, but you feel like shit, well, guess what? Your training is going to go down, your mood, your sleep, and you're just not going to be able to adhere to that diet. So I would say, even if you're losing fat, but because it's going to make you feel like shit, the chances of you adhering to that diet is going to be very low. And it's just a matter of time that you're going to fuck everything up and overindulge and backfire. So you want to make sure you find what works for you. So macronutrients only determine how you feel, but they cannot magically make you lose weight or gain weight. It's the combination in terms of the amount that you consume or that energy balance that's going to dictate whether you're going to lose fat or not. In my practice, what I consider low carb is 1.5 grams to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight, meaning that if you're 100 kilograms, the lowest I would go, it would be about 150 grams to 200 grams. So that's the range I would go, 1.5 gram to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. That's what I consider low carb. Anything lower than that, of course, there are some people that might respond well to that, especially if genetically they're not very engineered to be able to handle a lot of carbohydrates. But for the majority of my clientele, that's the number that I like to be playing around with. So 1.5 to 2. Now, when is the best time to consume carbs? In my opinion, it should be around your workouts as well as evening. So when it comes to workout time, it's best to do it a little bit before and a little bit after, because you want to make sure that you're providing your body with the fuel to prevent the breakdown of muscle tissue as much as possible. So that the carb you're going to have pre-workout is going to be used as an immediate fuel source so that your body doesn't have to turn to your muscle. Remember, you're going to be at a caloric surplus or negative energy balance to begin with in a fat loss cycle. So having carbohydrates before training is fine, especially since you're going to be having a higher training volume. So it's absolutely fine. And of course, post-workout to replenish as much as possible. The other time to have carbohydrates would be evening. Evening is also a great time to have carbohydrates, mainly because of your circadian rhythm. Circadian rhythm is like your body's internal clock. In the morning, you want your stress hormones like adrenaline or cortisol to be high to mobilize energy and deal with the stress of the day. As the day goes by, you actually want them to decrease, and for hormones such as melatonin to come up, and also for a neurotransmitter like serotonin, which is produced in the brain and in the gut, to also be high. So when serotonin and melatonin are high, cortisol is going to be lower, and that's how exactly you want it to be in the evening, because in the evening is not the best time to be dealing with a lot of stress, because it's closer to the sleep time. Okay, so you want to make sure that around evening time you can have some carbohydrates to increase your serotonin, and melatonin naturally is going to be higher, so you're providing a good environment for your body to be relaxed, to be calm, so that you can take advantage of a good sleep. That's it, guys. We have come to the end of this video. Of course, there were not everything that there is to know about carbohydrates, but I'm sure that would give you a great starting point once you start to implement those tips into your lifestyle. Thank you so much for watching, and in the upcoming video I'm going to be talking about the micronutrients. So I hope you guys watch the next video. If you haven't, please subscribe, like, and share this video if you liked it. Thank you so much, and see you in the next video.